Some terrible things are happening to our children. They are becoming the marketplace for unscrupulous corporations. They're no longer people. They're no longer youngsters that are going to grow up and become adults.
I'm profoundly interested in wearables. The company, and they started making electronic tattoos. Work with them to advance a tattoo that could be used for authentication. So I'm wearing one here on my arm, and it has an antenna and some sensors embedded in it.
They're markets. Everybody's trying to make a market in our children.
I think the cure is mind reading, and I think we're going to accept that cure.
So you've got your limbic system, your cortex, and the tertiary layer, which is the digital AI extension of you. And that high bandwidth connection is what achieves the tight symbiosis.
But there's still some fundamental problems that we haven't solved. Like one of them is the mechanical mismatch between humans and electronics.
His company is working on a way to plug in your brain to a computer chip.
And everyone will wear them because people have shown that they're quite willing to give up privacy for convenience.
Electronics are boxy and rigid, humans are curvy and soft. That's a mechanical mismatch problem.
You want kids buying something? How about ways to kill yourself and why to kill yourself? What is that? That's not the higher human intellect educating us. That's the evil part of human intellect, doing anything to make a buck off children. What about all the junk food? Why are our kids obese? Why are they going to grow up and have heart disease at an early age? Because the adults in our culture are more interested in making money selling them garbage. Why aren't our kids exercising in school as much anymore? Why aren't they doing as much music and dance and other fun things? Not because they want to grow into the kind of human beings that founded this nation, who thought a lot and read and considered life. You got videos that are destructive to human values. You got videos about suicide or movies or whatever. Show it to kids. Kids will buy it.
And we're probably not going to accept it because we're old. Our kids, maybe even our kids' kids are going to be the first people to adopt it, and then it's going to be universal worldwide.
It may be true that 10 to 20-year-olds don't want to wear a watch on their wrist, but you can be sure that they'll be far more interested in wearing an electronic tattoo, if only to piss off their parents.
Essentially, vast numbers of tiny electrodes that are able to read right from your brain. I think that's the best outcome. I hope so. If anybody's got better ideas, I'd love to hear it.
The Food and Drug Administration has approved a new medical device to treat ADHD in children.
It delivers electric pulses to your kid's brain while your kid sleeps.
One of the biggest disasters of all was when the drug companies decided and the government aided and abetted them in turning our children into a market for psychiatric drugs. I know something about this tendency to abuse children. In the 1970s, I stopped through years of reform work, operations on little black children in Mississippi with electrodes hanging out of their heads. It was very hard to get anybody even interested in it. Maybe because it's so terrible. What came in freaked me out. I could not believe the stuff these people were sending to me. What I found that most upset me was that at the University of Mississippi in Jackson, a surgeon named O.J. Handy was operating on little children as young as age 3, 4, and 5 for hyperactivity, aggressivity, difficult behavior. These were institutionalized children. O.J. Handy was inserting multiple electrodes into various portions of these children's brains. He was stimulating them, and then he was burning holes in their heads with the electrodes by heating them up. And he was then studying the children who walked around on the ward with wires dangling out of their heads. And he was the first project I stopped. In the 1990s, many years later, my wife Ginger and I discovered that there was a eugenical program sponsored by multiple agents in the federal government called the Violence Initiative, the Youth Violence Prevention Initiative. They were going to start studying African American kids in the womb to see what made them grow up to be so violent. Not racism, not unemployment. They weren't going to look at that. They weren't going to look at gangs. They weren't going to look at who sells all the drugs to these kids and then gets them selling the drugs as their way to make money. They weren't going to look at anything real. They were going to experiment on these children. And Ginger and I took 4 or 5 years out of our lives. We wrote a book called The War Against Children of Color, and we stopped the program. Do you know they still do electroshock treatment on children, not just adults? About 2 months ago, we finally, with me as a medical expert, had a big victory in court where a judge declared that he was going to let us go to trial because I had developed and shown enough scientific information that shock treatment caused brain damage that this judge decided that he was going to allow a trial on whether an individual had had brain damage from shock treatment. Within a day or two, the company settled. The company made an admission to the FDA that shock treatment causes brain damage and significant memory loss, and we thought, what a victory. And within 2 or 3 days later, a mere 2 or 3 days later, the device people, not vice, but device people at the FDA, for the first time came out and openly approved ECT as safe and effective. So this is a prelude to something that a lot of Americans, not generally physicians or doctors or psychiatrists or government officials, but the public's beginning to realize that our children are drowning in drugs. And we've got probably at least 20% of our boys diagnosed ADHD and on drugs. And the drugs don't work. We know with absolute clarity that the drugs don't help the kids, but they do stunt their growth, give them cardiovascular problems, make them addiction prone. We know all that. Well, now we get to why I'm talking to you. My friend Michael Cornwall, a psychologist in California, sent me a notice that the FDA had approved something new for ADHD in children, that children would now, with a prescription from their doctor, be able to get a little machine that their parents or guardian could put electrodes on their foreheads to stimulate their brains with an electrical current strong enough to affect the functioning of the entire front of the brain, to leave it there all night long for day after day after day.
Battery-powered device offers a non-drug treatment. It's a small electrode patch connected to a battery-powered stimulator.
The Food and Drug Administration has approved a new medical device to treat childhood ADHD.
The Food and Drug Administration has approved a new medical device to treat ADHD in children.
It's something that is first of its kind. It delivers electric pulses to your kid's brain while your kid sleeps.
A small adhesive patch is put onto the forehead. It then delivers a low-level electrical pulse to the parts of the brain that cause ADHD symptoms.
It's worn on the forehead, usually overnight, and that triggers branches of the sensory trigeminal nerve, where they're thought to interact with nearby brain structures that affect hyperactivity. The head of the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation says, while it's not clear how this affects hyperactivity, we do know that behavioral brain circuits are complex.
And by affecting those circuits, sometimes with electrical stimulation, as is the case with this device, we can therefore affect the illness itself.
The device from NeuroSigma was just approved, and it's available by prescription, but it's another tool in the armamentarium.
Now that's a pretty massive intrusion. They even know the various parts of the brain that are being affected, and they claim it relates to ADHD. It actually relates to the entire functioning of the child. The frontal lobes are affected, the limbic system's affected, and then they say, that has to do with ADHD. No, that has to do with being a child, being a human being. It's the whole integrating higher part of the brain is being stimulated. It's kind of a mild electroshock that goes on and on and on, and it bears similarity to a lobotomy because the current's going to go through the same areas that they used to love so much to slice up. The frontal orbital areas, it's right behind the eyes, it's right where the lobotomists used to like to go in and damage the human brain.
The very choice of name for this brain interface technology that's supposed to be a psychiatric treatment for ADHD and useful for many applications, the very name of this product is astounding because the butterfly has long been a symbol of the human soul and its transitory life from physical human form into an immortal form where there's no body containing it. Ancient Greek mythology, the talks of Plato, the work of Ovid and the Metamorphosis, all of these encompass aspects of the myth of Psyche, who married Cupid, who was made immortal by Zeus. And this figure Psyche herself is a representation of the human soul personified, but is also symbolized by the butterfly, because the butterfly starts in a pupal stage as a crawling worm. It goes through the chrysalis stage, where it's effectively dormant, dead in a certain sense inside the chrysalis, and then it's reborn into a creature with wings that could fly freely. And for the ancient Greeks and other ancient philosophers, this was representative of the human soul. And it's also been a symbol of mind control in the more recent times. Although it remains in the foray of rumor, the idea of Project Monarch carries a heavy symbolic weight and reflects the very real documented efforts of dabbling in mind control and reprogramming the brain.
In the 1970s, the public was confronted for the first time with the fact that the Central Intelligence Agency had carried out a bizarre series of behavior modification and mind control experiments on unwitting citizens in what CIA Director Alan Dulles referred to as the battle for the minds of men.
The first thing that needs to be said is it's an experimental procedure.
We see here the possibility for direct physical manipulation of the mind.
We know that efforts took place, we just don't know if they used the name Monarch. But if they did use that name, it would have been very meaningful and perhaps poignant and just eerily creepy as to what they're talking about being able to do, to transform the mind in a certain sense, to create a new type of human, to be able to program people according to someone else's will.
Delgado has remote control of the animal.
The electrical stimulator in the skull responds to radio stimulation. The bull becomes non-aggressive. Does it tamper with lines?
Aggression can be evoked or inhibited.
So with that as a background, it's very creepy that this company, NeuroSigma, used the name Monarch for their brain interface device that's to be used with children who are struggling with certain types of conditions and disabilities. It's very creepy because the actual name NeuroSigma itself is a species of butterfly, and of course it's a play upon words, with neuro referring to the science of the brain. It's just really astounding and kind of a slap in the face.
Now, this is a pretty dramatic thing to do to children. It's never been approved for the treatment of a brain. If you look at other instruments that are putting electricity through your muscles or something, they They tell you, don't do this to your brain. Don't put it on your head. Because see, the brain is the highest evolutionary achievement on Earth and maybe in the universe, the human brain. We don't know how it works. We don't have any Einstein to tell us about it. It's too complicated. We barely have, we don't even have a Newton. We don't have any great neuroscientist to tell us how it's working. It's far more mystery than a known area. We talk about the surface of the sea versus the deep sea. Our knowledge of the brain is beyond metaphor, how small it is compared to the complexity of the brain. After all, you wouldn't be listening, I wouldn't be speaking. None of this could go on without the most complicated organ in the universe being active. Just couldn't happen. So how long did the device people at the FDA test the children? Any guesses? A year, 2 years, 3 years? Make sure it wasn't going to hurt them? Because that's how long a lot of these kids will be on it. There's no limit. They can be on forever as far as the company is concerned, as far as the FDA is concerned once they've approved it. So how long do you think? Do you think it was months and months? 4 lousy weeks. The testing was for 4 lousy weeks. Now how many kids do you think that were involved? Well, if it was a drug, there'd be hundreds of people in clinical trials, many hundreds. 32 or 3 kids. So it was tested for 4 weeks on 32 or 3 kids, and then unleashed on children. Now, the company clearly wanted something more than 4 weeks, because it only began to, quote, work around the 4th week. What does work mean? It always means the same thing in psychiatry. Work is when you get blunted. That's when the treatment works. It's when it disrupts your functioning enough that that troublemaking brain of yours isn't making trouble anymore. And then your brain fights back and it makes trouble again, because you haven't learned to master it. You haven't learned to live properly. Well, the company offered these, I think it was 32 children, their families, to continue the treatment. Half did not. Why did those half not? Then it offered the ones who said they wanted to do it, they offered to do it for 12 months. And out of those 30 plus kids, only 3 finished. Why? What happened? What went on? They don't tell us. It's very hard to pry any information out about this. Now, why is this something that has got a grown man like me just deeply, profoundly distressed? Because I know where it's going. And no way that most of you watching me today have any idea where it's going. Well, I'll tell you where it's going. And I talk about this on my radio shows. I did 2 recent radio shows. You can get them on Breggin.com. Cornwall, the psychologist, said, I know just where it's going because I've worked in the government. I've worked with children that are being treated in government institutions and foster care. And what happens is these children get put on 3, 4, 5 drugs. Now somebody's going to come along and say, this is safer than drugs. That's how it's being pushed. This is safer than drugs. So we can give it in addition, or maybe more, be real cheap to give it instead of the drugs, or in combination with the drugs. And they can give it for anything. The doctor can prescribe it for anything once it's FDA approved. So it doesn't matter whether it's pediatrician, OBGYN, I mean, they can prescribe it for any disorder. They got the VA to be experimenting with similar things on vets. And the Army was involved. And finally, they stopped. They got a report saying this thing doesn't work and it's dangerous. This is what our kids are going to be on. They've been pushing it for the same thing, for dementia, for depression, for post-traumatic stress disorder. And then they figured out, hey, we'll go to the device department. They hate kids. And they got it approved for children. Now it can be given to adults. That was their entering wedge. Now, can you imagine if this becomes like a fad? What, you haven't tried this on Joey? Joey looks to me like Jimmy did. Jimmy's much calmer now. Aren't you, Jimmy? Yeah. What's karma mean, Mom? It has no limit in how it can be used. Well, I tell you, after I started talking about it a little bit with my wife, Ginger, she looked at me and she said, you know how they keep upgrading your watch and upgrading your phone? Once they get these things clipped on the kids, it's going to be so easy. With the electroshock machines, for example, the FDA let the shock machine manufacturers, without ever testing the machines at all, they never were tested, and then they let them raise the amount of current being given to 10 times what it takes to cause a convulsion, 10 times what we used to give in the old days. So the newer shock machines are juiced up, for example, to give 900 milliamps fixed or 800 milliamps of current fixed, enough to put you in a coma. It does, put you right into a coma. Whereas, in the days it was supposed to be bad times for shock treatment, we used to use 80 milliamps, not 900, or maybe 100 milliamps. So they'll have access to the kids now. The FDA device folks, they're not going to stop them. They didn't stop them from doing the psychosurgery on children. I had to do that. The device people, they probably won't even monitor these guys. They don't monitor shock machines. Why should they monitor these little mini things? So they'll be able to do their updates and their fixes and raise the current just like the shock people have been doing year after year after year. And pretty soon we'll have kids walking around who are half themselves. Well, Michael Cornwall and I have set up a new organization called Stop the Psychiatric Abuse of Children. Yes, I'm a psychiatrist. I'm a medical doc. He's a PhD psychologist and a therapist. So we're starting this organization, SPAC. I love that, SPAC, S-P-A-C, Stop the Psychiatric Abuse of Children. If you go to my website, Breggin.com, and you just scroll down 2 or 3 of the banners, and you'll get to the children's section. It talks about drugs and electrical interventions. And the first thing you're going to read about is SPAC. You'll be able to go and get articles that tell as much about this terrible new thing they've invented. The machine is called the Monarch. I'm begging folks out there, don't let this get started. It's going to be a nightmare. Even if it were placebo, which it is not, because it's causing headaches and, other problems in the first 4 weeks, because that's as long as the studies went. It's not a placebo. But even if it were, what would it be teaching our kids? What would it be preparing our children for? We've already got them having friends. Every child now has friends who are on psychiatric drugs. Most children now know children who have killed themselves. And if you read any of my stuff, it's mostly because of the drugs. What's going to happen when Tom thinks that he's not in unless he tries this and talks his mother into it? What happens when the pediatricians and primary care docs find out, it's so much easier to just write a prescription for this machine than to try to figure out what's going on in the family and how can they help the kid and so on. And the FDA is literally advertising it. You'll actually see a promotional piece by those people at the device section of the FDA praising this product, praising it. It's actually a talking point for the company. So I know this is grim, but I want to build SPAC. Go to the website, learn about it, see what you'd like to do. For them, on the other side, this is the inroad that's going to just go right toward, I'll say the words, it's going to go toward mind control. I'm being filmed today by Aaron and Melissa Dykes, did the marvelous film, The Minds of Men, in which I'm happy to say I'm featured, talking about the history of mind control. because I've been an activist and actually not making up stories about it, but cutting off federal funding for it. I want to thank them for being the first folks to film me on this subject. I've only been doing this for a little bit now. I'm just finding the people. But if we don't stop the FDA and Monarch and all the people waiting to start doing this to everybody they can think of, as they're really already doing informally, our children are going to be taking another step toward thinking they're machines, toward thinking that their brains can be tinkered with, to getting used to it, to allowing it, to thinking it's fun maybe. Remember, brain-damaging things have often been felt to be fun by kids. Sniffing glue, drinking alcohol. Now a lot of them are doing heavy drugs. The fact that something is going to harm them isn't going to stop them. May even encourage them. Kids are complicated. They need guidance, they need love, they need somebody to say, no, we're going to protect you from other adults. We're not going to let them have sex with you, we're not going to let them put electrodes on your head, we're not going to let them beat you, we're not going to let them give you all kinds of things in your body that aren't good for you, we're not going to let them sell you junk food, we're going to intervene, we're going to take charge, and we're going to say no more abuse of children. And as a psychiatrist, for me, it's going to start with stop the psychiatric abuse of children. Gone too far. I can see where it's going. It's going right back to the days of psychosurgery and lobotomy. It's just an open window. Help me stop it.
It delivers electric pulses to your kid's brain while your kid sleeps.
A small adhesive patch is put onto the forehead. It then delivers a low-level electrical pulse to the parts of the brain that cause ADHD symptoms.
It's worn on the forehead, usually overnight, and that triggers branches of the sensory trigeminal nerve.